Okay, this is going to be, we're going to finish up chapter 1 and get into chapter 2 in this one. And this is the third part. It involves 2 chapters this week. Before we jump into chapter 2 and the slides that go along with it, there's one final slide that I didn't finish up with chapter 1. But this recording doesn't allow me to switch PowerPoint slides in the middle of it. So I'm going to go ahead and summarize that PowerPoint slide without you actually looking at it while I go over it. So forgive me for that, but the timing was just right on was not right on the last segment. Anyway, that final slide, first of all, talks about the basic demographics of these mass killers. And again, the focus tends to be on the high profile. That's one bias that the author brings into this textbook, is a focus on high profile crimes that get a lot of media attention, but we as criminologists don't rely on media selections, high profile cases, to understand the general phenomenon of mass killings. And so I'm going to rely on data as opposed to sort of, the high profile cases, the ones that get a lot of media attention, because those sort of distort the general picture. So the demographics for these killers are that they're almost all male. The perpetrators of these crimes are about 98% male. They tend to be young, 20s. School shooters occasionally, these school shooters could be younger. It tends to follow the violence crime curve for violence in general, that violence increases among teenagers, peaks among young adults, and then gradually descends as one gets older. And you do see some middle-age shooters, but they're less frequent than the younger shooters. So it doesn't really depart very much from the ages that you see of common street criminals. Violent street criminals. Now, in terms of the author stresses, and you do see quite a bit in literature, this stresses the preponderance of white perpetrators, and that is increasingly true the more you're focusing on the cases that get a lot of media attention. So the high-profile cases, you do see higher percentages of males in those crimes, higher percentages in the school shootings, which tend to get a lot of media attention. These crimes, these mass shootings or mass killings that don't get much media attention, or that are excluded from the data analyses, specifically what I'm talking about here are the gang-related killings and the family killings, which again are quite common among mass killings. Those, the numbers, the percentages that are white drops a lot, and you get a lot higher percentages of poor minority perpetrators, especially in the case of gang shootings. That's largely perpetrated by racial and ethnic minorities, poor minorities. And so that's closer to the dynamics of the kind of ordinary street crime. These mass shootings that are high profile, that get immediate attention, they're the sort of the exception. They don't really fit the pattern of ordinary street crime. And that's probably one of the reasons why they get a lot of media attention, is the media likes to focus on the sort of rare, unusual event, which tends to be more provocative and is less ordinary, so it grabs people's attention. Anyway, so keep that in mind, that a lot of these findings or the conclusions that the author is drawing are of the crimes that are very high profile and have gotten a lot of media attention. Let's start off. Let's see. What else do I want to say about that's basically it on the demographics. Also, the author stresses sort of like the violent history of the United States, and how there's been a lot of racial, ethnic conflict in the history of the United States, when ethnic racial minorities have been the victims of hate crimes of various types perpetrated by oftentimes whites. And so she sort of lays that down as the context, but you have to understand that, if we're talking about mass killings in general, the races, the racial distributions are not nearly as sort of as she's describing, because if you look at the overall victims of these mass shootings that we're focusing on in this course, over half of those victims, the majority of those victims, are white. And so it's not, most of these crimes, again, are not consistent with sort of a hate crime, with racial animosities going way back in American history. That's not again, as I said in previous segments, that's not really the dynamic of most of these mass shootings. That there's not this this sort of racial element or ideological element. Is those sorts of crimes are more the exception than they are the general pattern for these mass killings. So again, there's a little bit of repeating the media focus, media attention, which tends to be selective and focuses on these high-profile cases and tends to racialize and politicize a lot of these crimes. So again, so the history of violence is certainly important to understand that there's been for example, a high rate of homicide throughout American history compared to similar countries. And so it's not that history is irrelevant, but for this type of crime, focusing on hate crimes and racial conflict and animosities throughout America's past is a little bit off point. And also, I would push back against her, finally, from chapter 1, of her saying that these mass shootings, mass killings, are preventable, and that she has sort of, at least I interpret it as an optimistic tone, and I certainly wish that I could take such that level of optimistic tone, because these are horrible crimes with many victims, and it's something that we do need to get a handle on, and do need to reduce. This is a social problem in the United States. It's a serious problem indeed. But I think my understanding of this crime, this type of crime, is the nature of it it makes it hard to prevent. It makes it hard to stop it. And you'll see this as we get further into the facts of the case. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying by any stretch that it's impossible, but I have a hard time being optimistic about it, because the solutions do not seem easy or super clear, and we still have a lot to learn about these crimes as well. They really have been ignored and not studied very systematically for decades. They were sort of at first flying underneath the radar. Now the public is paying a lot of attention to them, but the research takes a long time to catch up. So we have a lot to learn. Let's jump into some additional charts that I found that I put in the beginning of chapter 2 here. The title of chapter 2 is Trends and Typology. So again, the author is focusing on some statistics here and patterns. So we're following her lead on that. Now you can see in this first chart that this is another depiction of the trends in mass shootings over time. Again, a different organization that has collected the data on these. And here you can see, smaller numbers than we saw before. The blue line, the bottom half of the graph there, shows those that are killed in mass shootings. And then on the right-hand side, you can see where it says wounded in mass shootings. It's the right scale. It's the number who are wounded. The number who are killed is in the lower half in the blue line. And you can see that the numbers per year are lower than in previous graphs that we've seen. So they're taking a stricter definition of what a mass shooting, what qualifies as a mass shooting. And you see significantly lower numbers. It bounces around a great deal from year to year. But up until, say, 2017 or so, you had, you had fewer than 20, maybe occasional year more than 20 killed. but that's a low number compared to other graphs that you've seen. In more recent years, you've seen some bigger events. You can see some spikes there after 2015. But again, the numbers are a lot lower than what we've seen in previous graphs, and that's because they're defining mass shootings more narrowly, with not as many crimes are eligible here, and they're only, so there's a lot of limitations. They're saying this counts as a mass shooting, and so the numbers are lower. We do see an increase in the past decade, but there's a lot of bouncing around there, so it depends a great deal on the particular year. There's a great deal of randomness to these crimes. In some years you only get a few, not many. In other years you get a very significant big number. And certainly it depends a lot on how big the events are. You get these high profile, rare events where you could get many victims, and then that would make these lines spike in a given year. Here's another little bit of a smoother graph here, where it goes all the way back to 1966, and a lot of times that's sort of the ground zero for mass shootings, because that was the year that we saw Charles Whitman shooting from the tower of University of Texas at Austin at students and individual staff, professors down below, and that was a very high profile, high publicity case, which sort of set off began to, gain public attention, but it really took a long time before this became calm enough that it really captured the concern of the public. But you see there over time, the right side of the graph goes up to 2022, and you can see this gradual increase in the number of mass shootings that are happening per year. But again, if you look at the y-axis on the left-hand side, you can see that it's still, the numbers are small compared to other graphs we've seen. So the way that these folks are defining mass shootings is strict. It's excluding a lot of cases. So yes, it's going up, but the numbers are much lower than we've seen before. So this definition things, what gets included, what doesn't get included, it's a big deal and a confusing thing when studying these mass shootings. But what's the takeaway from this graph? I think the takeaway is that things have gradually, the number of shootings has grown over the years in sort of a gradual fashion, really taking off, maybe say the past 30 years plus. Maybe, maybe Columbine would be probably a little bit before Columbine. Anyway, but you see it's this gradual increase up to a significantly higher level now than back in the 60s. Let me also say again that when I look at this graph, I don't see support for the idea that general gun availability is driving this, because if you recall from that earlier graph, over the same period of time, the 70s forward, the percent of households that have any guns at all has been dropping, has been drifting down significantly since the 70s for the past 50 years. So it's going in the opposite direction, while the number of households, the percent of households, I should say, with at least one gun or multiple guns has been drifting down over the past 50 years. The number of mass shootings has been going up. So that's the opposite of what we'd expect if reducing gun availability would reduce mass shootings. It's not, the data is not matching up with that hypothesis. So that's kind of even clearer looking at this particular graph, because it matches up time-wise with that earlier graph that shows gun ownership. Here's another. I just found various sources to try to look at trends, and you can see that the bottom line there represents the United States, and you see sort of a bouncing around from year to year. But if you smooth that out, you see an increase in the number of people, or the rate of murders involved in these mass public shootings. That bottom line is the United States, and then the top line is the rest of the world. And so what's the word, image or stereotype is that the United States has much more mass shootings, mass killings than the rest of the world. But you can actually see that the trend line started out higher, 25 years ago, and for the rest of the world, and has continued to increase, and not only increase, but increase faster than the United States. And again, to understand, it might be confusing, like, well, this doesn't happen around the world. The U.S. type of attacks, these school shootings, these random attacks, these weird, mysterious attacks that don't really seem to have any motivation, that's common in the United States. But what you see that's common in parts of the world are terrorist attacks where they use guns. And so that's what that top line is showing, is terrorist attacks, not showing the sort of weird school shootings, these sort of, what's the motivation with those, this phenomenon that you have at a high level in the United States. So that's what that line is showing there. But what I want to stress from this graph is this is another source of data that's showing an increase in the murders from these mass shootings in the United States over the past 25 years. So it's another source showing the same story, that things have been getting worse and going up. Now, the author makes a claim that more mass shootings are bias motivated. So, but again, I think that she is drawing that conclusion based on media events. There's these high-profile cases for the past several years where there's been some bias crimes, these sort of these individuals who are ideological, who harbor resentment and hatred for a particular religious group or a racial group, and they go, say, shoot up a church or something like that, a synagogue. There's been some high-profile cases of that. And so the high-profile cases has increased. But if we're looking at the general phenomenon of these mass killings, and I have not seen evidence of that is on the increase. Yes, for the high-profile cases, that appears to be the case. But again, I go to data as opposed to media coverage, because media coverage is just, in my experience as a criminologist, does not reflect the general reality of crime in any accurate way. It's just not a good place to base your conclusions about crime on media depiction. You have to look at the hard data. Let's see. Let's stop there. Again, there's lots to talk about. We'll continue on in the next segment.